Good morning, America. Today I want to continue talking about the French Revolution. Alright, once we get to 1793, there is a major change in the French Revolution. Now, up to this point, things have been radical, but not too radical, if that makes sense. At least in the sense that there is still a king, Louis the 16th, and that things still have at least some vague resemblance to how they had been before. Now, the big change is that at the very end of 1792, King Louis is no longer around. He's out of the picture. The reason for that being that he loses his head, literally. In late 1792, King Louis and Queen Marie are both put on trial for being not very nice people, and they are convicted of being not very nice people, and they are executed. Now, their method of execution is one that will become very iconic for the French Revolution, that is to say, the guillotine. The guillotine was a new invention for this era in history. It becomes emblematic of the way they do executions during the French Revolution. The concept is very simple. You have a framework like this, and you have a bench across here. The person lies down with their neck under the framework. Then you have a knife blade suspended like this with a slanted blade. The executioner stands over here. When it's time for the execution to take place, the blade is dropped, it falls by gravity, and does its work. So anyway, King Louis and his wife are both executed, and that is the end of the old French monarchy. Now, what comes after Louis XVI execution is the most radical stage of the French Revolution, which is the first we have the Directory, and then we have the Reign of Terror. So the new constitution that is put in place makes France into a monarchy. It is ruled by a group of people who call themselves the Directory. However, before long, the real power shifts not to the Directory, but rather to a group calling themselves the Committee of Public Safety. And the Committee of Public Safety really comes to be dominated by a handful of individuals. Probably the most powerful of these is a man named Maximilien Robespierre. And he also has a couple of revolutionary henchmen, one named Danton and one named Murat. So we have Robespierre is really the most powerful of them. Robespierre seizes control of the Committee of Public Safety, and he uses the Committee of Public Safety as his tool to form the revolution into the image that he sees fit. Now, unfortunately for a pretty good sized number of people, the image that he sees fit is one in which large numbers of people lose their heads. Robespierre institutes a reign of terror against anyone that he and his cronies deem to be enemies of the revolution. Who is an enemy of the revolution, you might ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. Top of the list of enemies of the revolution is going to be anyone who was an aristocrat under the old system. Automatically off with their heads. They are going to be highly suspect because they were servants of the old regime. Aside from the aristocrats, anyone who says or does anything that the Committee of Safety doesn't like, anyone that Robespierre and his friends feel is a threat to their authority, anyone that they have reason to believe is conspiring against the revolution to help out France's enemies, all these people are going to go to the guillotine. You have large numbers of people being arrested, put on trial in very summary, casual group trials, then thrown into wagons, hauled out to the place of public execution, and guillotined one by one. Some tens of thousands of people were executed over a span of a little less than 2 years in 1793 and 1794 is when this is happening. Now, there's also other extremely radical changes that are taking place in France during this time period. France is completely reorganized from the bottom up to enforce a new vision of what the revolution should look like. Now, allegedly, the values of the revolution are liberté, fraternité, égalité. Liberty, fraternity, and equality. Everybody addresses each other as citizen. There's no more bowing and scraping and divisions of rank. Everybody is just citizen. And there are other changes that are designed to make society more equal. Some of those are useful, perhaps, like, for example, standardizing the system of weights and measures to switch to the metric system, reorganizing France into divisions called departments, all designed to make a business easier and life a little bit more rational. There are some other changes that perhaps are a little bit harder for people to swallow. One of those is the extreme secularization of life. France is a very religious country in the 18th century. Most people are Roman Catholics. The Reformation never really made it to France in large numbers. There are some Protestants, but most people are still Catholic. And the Catholic Church was very powerful in France up until the Revolution, but no more. The Catholic Church is dethroned from its position of authority in French life and government. The clergy lose all their power and most or all of their property. The church's property, which was quite substantial in France, is confiscated by the government and sold off, and they actually printed money that was backed by the assets of seized church property and used that as their money. Christianity is... the revolutionaries, particularly people like Robespierre, they're atheists. They hate Christianity. They want to do away with it entirely. They want to switch to a secular system. And the system they envision is, they call it the cult of reason. And so, instead of things like Mass being said in the churches and cathedrals, some of them are shut down. Some of them are turned into temples to the goddess of reason. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris actually becomes the temple of reason, in which celebrations are held to the goddess of reason. Now, this is relatively short-lived because it's all patently ridiculous, but for a relatively brief period of time, this is what's actually going on. And they do their level best to wipe any mention of Christianity out of French government and French culture. They even go so far as to completely redo the calendar. So they change the names of the months. All the months have new names. They no longer have the French version of their good old fashioned names. Instead, they have new names. You like Thermidor, for example, and so forth. They also changed the system of weeks. No more 7-day weeks. Well, what do they have against the 7-day week? Well, it's because it comes out of the Bible. God created the world in 6 days, rested on the seventh. That's why we have a 7-day week. The French revolutionaries didn't like that because it involved God. So they did away with 7-day weeks. They went to a 10-day week because that's so much more rational, because everything else is base 10. Metric system is base 10. 10 is such a nice even number, so we should have a 10-day week. Work 9 days and rest 1. Yeah, that didn't work out very well. Nobody could handle it. Everybody got sick, even the horses. They couldn't handle a 10-day week, so eventually they had to give up on that and went back to the good old-fashioned. They also redid the numbering of the years, because the years in are numbered, of course, from the birth of Christ, AD Anno Domini, year of our Lord, and they didn't want that anymore. So they started over the numbering system with numbering from the beginning of the French Revolution. So they start over with year 1. And that lasted, I think they got as far as about year 6 or 7, and then they gave up on that and went back to the old system. But anyway, for a few years, they do their level best to secularize French culture, completely do away with everything old. And the French Revolution, it becomes very radical. Now, it's easy to try to pass moral judgment on it. If we're going to go that route, I think there were some good things that came out of it. In addition to writing a new constitution, the National Assembly also came up with a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And there was also a Declaration of the Rights of Women, too. That came a little later, but they came up with that as well. But, and these are kind of like the French version of the Declaration of Independence. Gosh, I wonder where they got that idea from. But the overall, the revolution, for a period of about 2 years there, gets really, really radical. Now, what brings the radical phase of the French Revolution to an end is it's really a victim of its own excesses. Eventually, so many people are being guillotined that everybody starts looking at each other. It's kind of like, who's going to be next? What if it's me? That's not good. We need to try to put some brakes on this. And Robespierre, in particular, people are absolutely terrified of him, even his own cronies. And so they start to say, maybe we need to put the brakes on this. And so, in the supreme irony of all ironies, Maximilien Robespierre is the victim of his own revolution. His fellow revolutionaries turn against him. He is denounced before his own Committee of Public Safety. He is accused of being an enemy of the revolution, and just like all his victims, he eventually is sent to the guillotine and beheaded. Oh, irony of ironies. The other revolutionary leaders met bad ends too. Marat, for example, he had a skin condition which required him to spend most of his time soaking in a bathtub, and in one of the great ironies, he was assassinated, stabbed in the back as he was sitting in the bathtub reading the newspaper. So most of these revolutionary leaders came to a really bad end. There's a famous painting of that too, by the way, by a French artist named David. Anyway, so the French Revolution in 1793, 1794, it runs its course. Some tens of thousands of people are executed on the guillotine, and but the revolution runs its course. Eventually, there is a reaction against the excesses of the revolution because people are terrified of how out of control things are getting. So the Committee of Public Safety runs things for a couple of years, but eventually people react against that, and that's set aside. So anyway, that is part 2 of the French Revolution.